Hello and welcome to another lesson of Arabi بالبيت. Today we're going to cover Form 1 sound verbs. This category includes verbs like رقص يرقص, كتب يكتب, درس يدرس, رسل يرسل, رقد يرقد, and لعب يلعب. Notice that none of these verbs have a waw or ya in the root. That's what makes them sound, or what we call in Arabic, الفعل الصحيح. In order to keep this lesson short, we're only going to focus on present tense conjugations for today. Form 1 verbs take on a very distinct pattern. In fact, in Arabic, verbs are not memorized by form, but rather by the pattern they take using the generic root fa, ain, lam. Native speakers refer to Form 1 by conjugating the fa, ain, lam root in the third person masculine singular past tense. So what we refer to as Form 1 in English, native speakers will say fa'ala. Since Arabic essentially has two tenses, past and present, I find it useful to memorize all verbs by the huwa conjugation pair, like fa'ala yaf'alu. Notice though that the middle radical, which corresponds to the ayn in the generic root, can take on different vowels like a fatha, a dhamma, or a kasra. The most common vowel for Form 1 is the fatha, but there are verbs like la'iba, meaning to play, that have a kasra on the middle radical. The only way to know the short vowel for the middle radical is to consult a dictionary and memorize it. This is the dictionary listing for the root raqasa, meaning to dance. The first part of the listing is the Form 1 verb in the past tense, huwa raqasa. The next part, which is in Roman characters, gives us the voweling for the past tense, which in this case is fathas across the board, raqasa. What we're looking for is the single letter that follows. This will give us the identity of the middle radical in the present tense. In this case, it's a U, which corresponds with a dhamma, so we know in the present tense we're going to have huwa yarqusu. Let's get started by conjugating raqasa yarqusu in the present tense. When I conjugate a verb, I like to start with an empty chart with only the huwa pronoun filled in from the dictionary. I'll go through each conjugation and then we'll deconstruct the patterns. أنا أرقص, أنت ترقص, أنت ترقصين. هو, which we get from the dictionary, يرقص, هي ترقص, أنتما ترقصان. هما masculine, يرقصان. هما feminine, ترقصان. نحن نرقص. أنتم ترقصون. أنتن ترقصن. هم يرقصون. هن يرقصن. Verbs are made up of three components, a prefix, a conjugated root, and a suffix. The prefixes in the present tense never, ever change. They are a hamza seated on an alif, which corresponds exclusively to the ana pronoun, a ta maftuha, which corresponds to all second-person pronouns, anta, anti, antuma, antum, antunna, and the non-plural third-person feminine pronouns, hiya and huma feminine. The ya prefix corresponds to the remaining third-person pronouns, huwa, huma masculine, hum, hunna, and lastly, the nun prefix corresponds exclusively to the nahnu pronoun. Again, these will never change in the present tense, regardless of the form of the verb or whether it's a sound, hollow, defective, doubled, or even hamzated verb. Be sure to memorize these patterns. Notice the vowel on all the prefixes is a fatha. This is specific to Form 1 verbs and also Forms 5 through 10. In Forms 2 through 4, the prefix vowel will be a dhamma, but we'll cover that later. There are 5 suffixes in the present tense. The dhamma corresponds to ana, anta, huwa, hiya, and nahnu. The ina suffix corresponds exclusively to anti. The ani suffix corresponds to the dual pronouns antuma, huma masculine, and huma feminine. The una suffix corresponds to antum and hum. And lastly, there's the na suffix, which corresponds to antunna and hunna. This suffix typically behaves a bit different than the rest. It's the only suffix in the present tense that begins with a consonant. When you're conjugating irregular sound verbs like yarqusu, remember that the third radical, which in this case is a sad, takes a sukoon for the antunna and hunna pronouns, so we get antunna yarqusna and hunna yarqusna. Let's try to conjugate la'iba yal'abu, which has a kasra on the middle radical in the past tense and a fatha on the middle radical in the present tense. You'll notice this verb will follow the same exact patterns as before. Just like last time, we're going to start with an empty chart with only the huwa pronoun filled in from the dictionary. أنا ألعب. أنت تلعب. أنت تلعبين. هو يلعب. هي تلعب. أنتما تلعبان. هما masculine يلعبان. هما feminine تلعبان. نحن نلعب. أنتم تلعبون. أنتن تلعبن. هم يلعبون. هن يلعبن. The prefixes haven't changed, they never will, but I highlighted them here so you can get used to the pattern, and the suffixes also didn't change. Notice that antunna and hunna, like in the previous example, kept the sukoon over the third radical. This concludes our lesson on Form 1 sound verbs in the present tense. Be sure to try out some verbs on your own, like darasa yadrusu, raqada yarqudu, and rasala yarsilu. The best way to become an expert is to practice, practice, practice. Thank you for tuning in. وشكرا إلى اللقاء.